Hi, everybody, and welcome to Chapter 4, Juveniles and the Police. So, as was previously discussed, police are the gateway to the juvenile justice system, and police are going to hold four major roles with juveniles who come into the system, and that's going to be number one, arresting delinquents. Number two is going to be processing delinquents and processing status offenders. Number three is juvenile delinquency prevention, and number four is protecting juveniles from victimization. So, police have a myriad of ways to go about achieving those objectives. And policing agencies will often have completely separate departments that specifically deal with juveniles. That's all they deal with. So, getting back to the history a little bit again, that early on in juvenile justice, we had policing matrons, not police officers. Policing matrons were women who were supposed to specifically focus on juveniles, juvenile delinquents. It was seen as a more like maternal role. And they were in charge of managing these offenders to change the behavior over time. Obviously, that role has been shed and left behind, and now this is a role for all police, male or female. I want to talk about the Juvenile Justice Delinquency and Prevention Act of 1974. It is often abbreviated, and I will verbally abbreviate it as the JJDPA Act of 1974. This was really important legislation that instituted widespread changes to the formal approach of handling juveniles once they come into custody. So the really important takeaway from the JJDPA of 74 is the sight and sound requirement, that when an officer makes an arrest and brings a juvenile into custody, that juvenile cannot be anywhere in sight or sound of any other adult individual in custody. So when an officer brings somebody in, a 13-year-old in, to the place, to the police station where they have holding cells, you cannot put a holding cell anywhere where that juvenile can see or hear the adults, or where the adults can see or hear that juvenile. And this is for their own protection. Right. Certainly, it's already really scary for a juvenile to be taken into custody. I imagine it's terrifying to, have to hear and listen to the onslaughts of the adult individuals in custody. So they have to do that for their own physical. They have to keep the kids separate for their own physical and emotional safety. According to the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, about 50%, half of all engagements that law enforcement have with juveniles are going to be for public disturbances, family violence. They're called to the house because, the neighbors hear this racket going on, what's going on over there, they're being really loud. Vandalism, complaints from the elderly, probably the most aggressive group of complainers where juveniles are concerned, or where juvenile misbehavior is concerned. Traffic enforcement and offenses against other children. So what's the processing? What's the process of processing juvenile delinquents? So first and foremost, there are confidentiality laws. And this is something that we extend to juveniles. We don't extend this to adults. And that is going to be statutes that protect the identity of the juvenile. It cannot be made public. It cannot be published in the media. And it's also going to protect the records of the juvenile in order to remove stigma. So the records are in existence until that juvenile hits the age of 18, at which point those records are destroyed. Again, we get back to that issue of stigma. We don't want to create a self-fulfilling prophecy. We don't want to create a label. We want kids to know, all kids make mistakes. All kids make bad decisions. And when you hit the age of adulthood, we want you to look back on those decisions and say, those mistakes, and say, they're done. They're in the past. Truly, they're gone. Because they are. They're destroyed. Those records are destroyed. And there's no public record. So even if there's a crime that happens and a juvenile will be arrested, the media cannot publish the juvenile's name, cannot publish pictures of the juvenile, or publish any, information about where the juvenile lives or where they go to school. There's complete anonymity. Okay. Representation. So this is where it gets a little dicey. Police in most juvenile jurisdictions cannot interrogate a juvenile without an attorney present. Notice I said most. That does not mean all. Okay. It is, I am not a police administrator, but certainly were I, it would be mandated in my organization. You cannot interrogate a juvenile without an attorney present, period, end of story, under all circumstances. Okay, not only for the protection of the juvenile, but for the protection of the agency, so that we can't be accused of taking advantage of, violating the rights of an adolescent. But there are jurisdictions and many states where this is not required. And law enforcement, adult law enforcement, members of law enforcement are able to freely interrogate a juvenile without a parent or an attorney present. Okay. It depends on the situation and the locale. It is best for all parties involved for there to be an attorney present. We call custody, the term custody is the same as arrest. Okay, so I want you to know that those terms are used interchangeably. Taken into custody, it's the juvenile term for being arrested. We've talked about status offenses briefly. These are enforced to protect juveniles, so they shouldn't be, because there shouldn't be kids out after midnight, and they shouldn't be running away from home, and they shouldn't be ditching school on a regular basis. Police also take time to deal with the unruly or the uncontrollable kids, juveniles into custody. This is that incorrigibility that we talked about in previous chapters. These are going to be the kids whose parents just can't get control over them. The kids are just wreaking havoc. And so police are going to come in and remove the child, bring the child into the system, excuse me, and they're going to be managed within the system. There's also something called model policies, and these are going to be written policies that are meant to standardize procedures for managing juveniles who are taken into custody. So, for example, some model policies would be that juveniles should never be handcuffed to any stationary object for more than 4 hours. Right? They should never be unattended while handcuffed. These are just model policies that we have that are specific to juveniles who are in custody that we do not have with adults who are in custody. Police are to make every effort to notify parents when they take a child into custody. This is a really big deal. Really big deal. Notice the language there. They are to make every effort, right? Some people make more of an effort than others, right? Parents need to know if their kids are in custody. Parents have the right to know. Parents have the right to be there to represent and guide their child. In no other instance in life do we allow any other adult to take our child and isolate them without parental notification and or involvement. Police should be no different. And largely for the protection of the child's rights, right? Being taken into custody is a big deal. It's scary. I think it's probably scary to any age, but it's really scary when you're an adolescent or when you're a child. You're not really quite sure of what your rights are. You're not really quite sure of what officers can and cannot do. And a lot of kids feel like, this is an authority figure. I have to do what they say. I have to answer their questions. Well, no, you don't, right? But a lot of kids do not feel that on their own, me, a 12-year-old, you, a 40-year-old officer, that I can exercise my rights. But if my attorney's here or my mom or dad are here and they tell me it's okay, now I feel like I can, right? It's this is why notification of parents is really important, right? Is making sure that rights are respected, that juveniles, their vulnerability, their lack of experience and knowledge are not exploited by arresting officers, and to make sure that everything is above board. Detention hearings should take place within 48 hours of the juvenile being taken into custody. There's also something called protective custody, and protective custody isn't an arrest per se. It's when police will take a minor into custody to protect the child from harm based on something that has been, they've been notified about a situation, or in just the course of their regular duties, they come across a situation where there's clearly abuse or neglect or something going on, so they can take the child into protective custody. So when kids are being abused, when they're being neglected, when they're being victimized, an officer can say, all right, we're going to take this child into protective custody. In order for protective custody to be exercised, there has to be any of the following have to be present. So there has to be physical evidence of abuse. So bruising, burns, broken bones, lacerations, like out of the norm, out of the ordinary. Or there has to be an obvious lack of supervision or protection. So let's say they, go to a house because they're serving a warrant, and, a 6-year-old answers the door, and you say, can I see your mom or your dad? And say, well, they're not home. Well, who's home? Is there an adult I can talk to? Well, I'm watching my brother and sister. Well, how old are your brother and your sister? Well, they're 3 and 4. Well, that's an obvious lack of adult supervision. They can be taken into protective custody. Any evidence of sexual abuse they can take into protective custody. This is often much harder to find evidence beyond child pornography. I mean, that's obvious evidence. Um, but without an admission from the child, which is very difficult. Obviously the nature of sexual abuse is very secretive and you're going to get me in trouble, so we don't talk about this, etc. But if there is ever an instance or something that just doesn't ring true, they can take the child into protective custody. For example, I knew a radiological technician whose father brought in a 4-year-old who was bleeding profusely from the anus, and he did not want to let that 4-year-old go alone with the radio tech to get the x-ray. Well, that's a red flag, right? I mean, first of all, why is any 4-year-old bleeding from the anus? And second of all, why is he so concerned about the 4-year-old being alone with the adult? He's afraid the 4-year-old's going to tell him, right? But if he's there, the 4-year-old won't. So that would be an example of obvious evidence of sexual abuse. And finally, any evidence of neglect. Whether the parents are home or not, if they go to, let's say they go to, again, serve a warrant, the parent is there, but you look around, the house is filthy, the kids are filthy, they're not properly dressed, it's December and they're not wearing pants, they look malnourished, you go to the kitchen and the only food you see is spoiled, things of that nature, they can take the kids into protective custody. Once protective custody is enacted, an investigation must commence, and other agencies like CPS, Child Protective Services, will come in and they will investigate. That's what they do. They look specifically at instances like this and say, yeah, you guys are breaking the law in a big way here, and we need to intervene and protect the children. You're going to lose custody, or, this doesn't rise to the point that we need to remove custody. But you know what? There are some things here that need to be worked on, and you're going to have to work with us so that we can see that these improvements are made. Like I said, police and discretionary decision making, they've always had a lot of discretion. They exercise more discretion with juveniles. What I will say informally is if they see the same juvenile again and again and again, that discretion is going to be less exercised. But when they do engage with juveniles on a first or a second time basis, they have a whole range of decisions that they can make, from ignoring the behavior and just letting it go to an informal adjustment, which is simply a talking to. I'm going to get stern and I'm going to be a police officer here. I'm going to scare the crap out of you and tell you how your life is going to be ruined, right? If you don't knock it off. To calling the parents and releasing the child into the parents' custody, letting the parents manage the situation, transporting the juvenile home to the parents, so driving the juvenile home. I mean, as a parent, I think it would probably be worse if, I certainly hope I never get this call, but Mrs. Staub, you need to come and get your son, versus they show up in my driveway in a marked car and ring on my doorbell and present my son. So recommending a referral to juvenile programs, recommending referrals to diversionary programs, a formal referral to the juvenile court, okay, or detention and referral to a juvenile court. There's a whole range of options there, and it is literally up to the officer, right? It's literally up to the officer, and the officers are going to make a decision based on the severity of the circumstance, the way that the juvenile interacts with them. If the juvenile is incredibly disrespectful, they're going to exercise less discretion. Excuse me. This is also going to be a guidance versus prescription issue. How do officers typically handle this offense? They're going to look at the offense and say, what's the kind of typical way we handle this, right? Do we have a standard operating procedure? How have I handled this in the past? Have I handled this in the past a certain way and I keep seeing that kid, or I handled it a certain way and I don't see him again? There's a lot of decisions that are going to go in there. Okay, and then like I said, delinquency prevention is another area that law enforcement spends a lot of time and resources on. And they do that in a myriad of ways. They want to stop delinquency before it starts, right? So there are different organizational methods that they use. So the first one's going to be PAL, P-A-L. It's just an acronym for Police Athletic Leagues. This one has seen a lot of success with adolescents. So for example, all-night basketball. So a lot of inner cities where there isn't a lot of supervision over kids, where there will be kids as young as 3 and 4, 5, 6, 7 walking around on the street until 1 o'clock in the morning because parents just aren't there. and parents aren't doing their job, they'll say, hey, at the rec center here, we're doing all night basketball. If you come, you can play basketball all night. We're going to have pizza. We're going to have soda. And literally, the officers go and they play with the kids. It gets them off the street. It gives them something pro-social to do. And it starts making relationships in the community for kids who are obviously not getting enough care at home. Start to get to know Officer so-and-so. And when they see Officer so-and-so out and about, they can say, hey, I'm having a problem. Or maybe next week when we meet for all night basketball, I know you a little bit better. I'm a little bit more comfortable coming and saying, I haven't had anything to eat in 2 days, or to bring officers problems that they can help you with. It's had a lot of positive success in terms of research and data. Another example would be the DARE program. Not as successful in terms of research and data. This is a program that teaches kids about drug use and the dangers of drug use. It has not had a lot of success in terms of lowering adolescent drug use, but it proliferated for a really long time. It's still out there too. GREAT is another one. It's a program where officers go to school to educate youth on the dangers of gangs and gang affiliation. Police Explorer, police cadet programs, police explorer posts. This gives young kids the opportunity to what I call get a taste of law enforcement. It's almost sort of like law enforcement camp, if you will, where they get to come for a certain period of days, and law enforcement are going to teach them about what they do. They're going to show them equipment. They're going to show them the cruisers and how the sirens work and law enforcement responsibilities. And they do all kinds of sort of activities with the kids, which is great outreach and great delinquency prevention. It's also great community police building.